The Russian military is desperate to find more people for its meat grinder war machine, but they also have to find a way to do it on the cheap. Just what is the bizarre Russian legal scheme to turn homeless, prisoners, and drunks into cannon fodder for Ukraine's front lines? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about that, plus a unusual partnership between Ukrainian drone manufacturers and the U.S. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is a really strange story from the investigative journalist arm of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And this reveals that Russia is actually operating a sort of black market recruitment scheme. Now, we've talked a lot about on this channel about how expensive the Russian recruitment effort has been because essentially casualties in the Ukraine conflict have been unbelievably high for Russia. They have exceeded 1 million casualties. Probably about 700,000 of those are permanent, never to be returned to the battlefield, either KIA or wounded so severely that there's no situation in which those individuals return to serve. So given that, what that means is that essentially the entire Russian active duty force of 2022 wiped out. The entire next army that they recruited from the Russian reserve forces has been wiped out. And probably every Russian that was going to sign up for patriotic reasons, that was in relatively decent shape, that would have been compelled by the high salaries, they've all been wiped out. What does that mean that Russia has to resort to? Well, generally, the rule has been over the last 12 months that Russia needs to offer insanely high paydays to these average Russians. For context, we did the math on this channel. If you're a U.S. citizen, it is the rough equivalent to the U.S. government going to the poorest counties in the state, rural Alabama, for example, or deep in the Appalachian Mountains, and offering military-aged males, the definition of which has stretched in Russia to 18 to 55 years old, and offering them $800,000 a year to fight. And that payday is compelling even for a lot of these men. But at some point, reality even seeps in. Even there is a point where casualties are so high that even there is no number where a certain percentage of Russian men will sign up to leave their families and go fight and die. And the problem is that Russia is running up against that number. So what do? Right? Because remember, the Russians also, we determined, have expended their entire recruitment budget already in the first half of the year, meaning that they have to find a way to get either supplemental funding from the state or find a way to recruit on the cheap. So Radio Free Europe has sort of exposed these Russian schemes to do so. Now, the Russian military, of course, has their recruiters recruiting in jails, prisons, and homeless shelters. And in some cases, in places like jails, for example, the Russian Ministry of Defense has said, if you volunteer, if you sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense, any legal charges you're facing instantly get expunged, which is actually, if you can survive, a pretty good deal. Let's say you rob a bank. You have a couple million rubles in a plastic bag buried in a Russian wood somewhere. You could just get off scot-free. You just have to survive an indefinite contract in the Ukraine war. And that's one of the problems that they found, is that a lot of the conventional Ministry of Defense contracts are indefinite. So the bonuses are very high, but they also have certain administrative requirements, right? You can't, for example, have been convicted of certain crimes. You have to meet certain basic health standards. You have to be able to, you are effectively, your contract is automatically renewed for the duration of the special military operation. So essentially you are serving until they run out of, until you are expired or the war ends, which at this point seems to be not going to happen anytime soon. So the Russians have constructed an alternate shadow pipeline using two areas. The first is an organization called Redut. Now, Redut basically is officially think of them as a competitor to the Wagner Group, a mercenary company that recruits from individuals who might not otherwise be eligible for recruitment. And this was a classic Wagner Group tactic. They were the first Russian paramilitary forced to go into prisons, but also to recruit people with disqualifying health conditions. Famously, Wagner troops would often not get treated in conventional Russian military hospitals because Russian military doctors found that a frightening number of them suffered from conditions like hepatitis or even HIV. And because these fighters were so incredibly ill with, infectious diseases, doctors would simply not treat them. But that gave Wagner a competitive advantage, if you will, in that they could recruit masses of men who at least were ill, but were still capable of at least carrying a gun and walking to their death. The other system is what Russia calls its Dobroker. Don't at me with my terrible Russian. This stands for is a sort of mashup of the Russian words for volunteer corps. And the volunteer corps, the Rita and volunteer corps are sort of two different black recruitment pipelines or underground recruitment pipelines that avoid the pesky Ministry of Defense contracts, right? Now, these contracts with Rita, for example, are mercenary contracts, which means that they are not uniformed service members of the Russian military, and therefore they are not entitled to benefits. But what they are allowed is to sign contracts for as little as 6 to 12 months with not automatic renewal. But there's a problem. When it comes time for those high attrition, dangerous missions, the Rita forces get called in first. And so while the odds of actually lasting the 12 months to complete your contract is basically none. But the volunteer corps also has their own kind of strange process, though interestingly enough, the pay is quite a bit lower. And in both of these, the recruits don't get access to some of the wealthiest Ministry of Defense bonuses. Right? As they point out, health and fitness requirements are lax. Criminal record, not a barrier to service. A criminal record, not a barrier to service with Dobroker, right? Now, what I thought was pretty interesting is that the sort of weird caveat with Rita is that because you're not a service member in the Russian military, you can't get charged with desertion. Desertion is a crime only soldiers can do. Rita, you're just an employee who left work early, which is pretty weird. But again, it's a sign, I think, of just how incredibly high volume the casualty rate is for places like Rita. And they have one quote from a Rita fighter who says, quote, from a legal point of view, he says, quote, you don't exist. There's no service-related benefits, nothing. No hospitals, no rehabilitation, nothing. But it's just a sign, I think, fundamentally, the fact that Russia feels it has to rely on these sort of black market platforms to work their way around existing recruitment constraints is pretty telling. And what's fascinating is, again, these guys are offered way less money, only about $2,600 a month than a conventional Ministry of Defense troop. And for Russia, that is a tremendous benefit, right? In fact, again, this is something that is almost entirely beneficial to Russia. They do not have the expensive veteran payments on the off chance these guys survive. The redut forces especially unlikely to survive because they're not entitled to hospital care. Again, getting hit by an FPV drone, you're not a wounded soldier. You are a worker who had a workplace injury. And as you can imagine, the compensation for workplace injuries in Russia, not great. And these guys earn less money. So they are ultra expendable. They are politically feasible in terms of casualties. And they they access a pool of fighters that basically are not available to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, is this a sign that Russian recruitment efforts are increasingly failing? Again, I think so. But the Russian strategy doesn't require skilled infantry. In fact, one Russian official that they interviewed actually explicitly said these guys are considered second-rate infantry that are sent into the fight to soften up Ukrainian positions or expose Ukrainian positions, and then true trained Russian infantry are then sent in to try to actually seize these positions. And we've seen even the state of Russia's existing infantry forces leaves something to be desired. But again, the thing to always remember is that in every war, every military wishes they had 6 million Navy SEALs, right? But you don't have that. You have to find the balance between getting the personnel you have, the training you have time to do, and the missions in front of them. At the end of the day, you don't need a Navy SEAL to be a drone pilot. You don't need a Navy SEAL to walk down a road and absorb a Ukrainian FPV drone in the hopes that the next wave won't have to deal with it. And that's core to the Russian strategy. So the answer is these guys are good enough, right? And the fact that Russia can do it on the cheap simply, I think, is a sign more about the fiscal realities facing Russia than the recruitment realities. Now, before we talk about some of the other wheeling and dealing that's happening on the Western side of the ledger, I wanted to mention, of course, guys, that I just got another video sent to me from one of my contacts in Ukraine, this time showing interdiction efforts of a Ukrainian interdiction of a Russian Shahed drone, or one of their more advanced reconnaissance drones. So if you're interested in seeing some of the latest tactics, latest techniques on the battlefield, you want to become a member of Combat Vet News. This is also the #1 way to support me. Again, when you become a member, it goes directly to me and the team to keep us operational, able to do this every single day, and most importantly, able to do it without needing to get any kind of funding or even necessarily making sponsor-friendly content. The fact that I can cover all of these stories, as uncomfortable as they may be, is a function of the fact that you guys have my back. So check it out, combatvetnews.com. There's also going to be a link below to our latest fundraiser for Ukrainian units. Again, listen, we gotta do our part to make sure these guys sign up with the expectation of getting those death bonuses. And so it behooves us to help the Ukrainians make sure these guys' families get their death bonuses. It's non-lethal aid. Don't worry. It's in compliance with all U.S. and EU law. In fact, it's even tax deductible. So the link's in the description. I'll pull it up real quick. Shout it out. It's our latest and by far our biggest fundraiser, our biggest solo fundraiser so far. We've broken $130,000 from you guys. Obviously, a bunch of sweet swag. Whoa, shout out to Anonymous dropping $1,000 donation. But also shout out to Jacob as I dropping $31. As I always like to point out, right? Every contribution helps a little bit. If James here looks like he decided, hey, I'm not going to go to Starbucks. Their coffee tastes like burnt ash anyway. I'm going to make coffee at home and hook up the Ukrainians, helping them defeat some drones, right? These efforts, these defensive tools that we're getting for the Ukrainians are going to allow these guys to go home. And again, that is something you guys should be proud of, right? You can be certain that a Ukrainian family is going to get their dad, their son, their brother back because we gave them the tools to survive in a tough battlefield. Okay. So on the Ukrainian side of the ledger, it seems like the U.S. is looking more and more sincere. I'm always skeptical when President Trump says he's going to do something because he says a lot of stuff, right? Literally just yesterday, he tweeted like an AI video of him arresting Obama. And it's like, dude, you've been president twice since Obama's been in office. What crime did you uncover, right? So he just says a lot of stuff, but actions are what counts. And his actions sometimes misalign with what he's saying. But in this instance, he seems to have meant what he said. So Germany is going to send 5 Patriot missile batteries to Ukraine soon with the assistance of the U.S. And while it wasn't specified that Germany would be getting backfilled by the U.S., it seems highly likely, given the fact that, again, this sort of aligns with President Trump's statement that he wanted to see aid go to NATO, but not aid, simply allowing the EU to make purchases of U.S. military equipment. And again, I think this is actually a pretty good system because let's look at global GDP chart here. I think this is really one of those good charts that remind us just how capable Europe is of financially sustaining this fight, right? So here's an example for context, guys, right? So we know, let's see if we can see Russia. Russia's this little blue guy right here. And they have an economy of total size of about $1.6 trillion, right? And you can compare that to China that has an economy 13 times its size, right? And at the end of the day, the war is being funded by Russia. Sure, China is helping or enabling them, but being an enabler is not the same thing as bankrolling the war. And you can see the United States, and the largest economy in the world, $20 trillion, and basically the world military powerhouse. We make so much military stuff. But you can see here that the United Kingdom alone, almost twice the size of the Russian economy. Germany, almost 3 times the size of the Russian economy. France, 2.5 times the size of the Russian economy. Italy, nearly 1.5 times the size of Russia. Spain, just Spain, roughly equivalent in economic size to Russia. So again, if you see all of these European economies say, listen, we're all going to pass around the hat and bankroll Ukraine, get them the munitions that they need, well, you can see how easy it would be for these countries to really just take out Russia without breaking a sweat. Because you have to remember that the German military basically exists to deter Russia, okay? China is not going to leap across the world and frighten Germany. The German military performs almost no expeditionary missions. The UK does a little bit. France does a little bit. But like Germany, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Poland, Norway, these are all countries that do very little overseas military operations. They exist to fight China, or exist to fight Russia. And so, you know, they are going to be willing to open up their wallets to help make the Russian military not great again. And I think the fact that the U.S. has said, yes, your money spends here, and you swipe, and you can buy whatever you want for Ukraine, is actually a huge difference maker. And we're seeing this start to happen already, right? 5 Patriot missile batteries, very, very important for taking out really Russian cruise missiles. They're the only system that can counter these Russian cruise missiles. There's other air defense systems that are more capable. But what's interesting is that in an interview with the New York Post, Zelensky said, hey, this arms deal can go both ways, guys. And we talked yesterday about the fact that, you know, the U.S. is proudly saying, listen, look at this. We can at least design our clone of the Shahed drone, right? A modern, something that both Iran has used against Israel, and of course, Russia uses to the tune of thousands a month against Ukraine. It's a very effective weapon on the modern battlefield. And if the U.S. wants to fight and win, it needs to be able to make Shaheds or other long-range drone equivalents dirt cheap. And the Ukrainians say, listen, guys, we're Ukraine. We are your friends. We aren't going to bail you out or sell you out. Why don't you buy our drones? They say, listen, we're Ukraine. Once this war ends, we're going to have the capacity to turn out 1 million FPV drones that are battle tested. We're going to be able to turn them out to the tune of millions, right? Zelensky says the American people need this technology. You need to have it in your arsenal. Why not do a mega deal with us? An agreement to sell Ukrainian drones to the U.S. or exchange them for U.S. weapons, a huge step for both countries, right? And of course, there's a long way, as other countries have pointed out, getting an actual trade exchange deal done with this White House is really tough. It's really tough. It's just very confusing. It's not even clear the U.S. has really been concrete about what exactly it wants. Again, it did a trade deal with Vietnam where the big breakthrough was selling our SUVs to Vietnam. Have you ever seen the streets in Vietnam? Like there's about 10 Vietnamese who would buy a U.S. style SUV. But I think this kind of thing to say, listen, we'll give the U.S. access to either our literal weapon systems or to sit there and go, listen, the U.S. can add and tweak some designs to our drones to get them better integrated into the U.S. arsenal. And Ukraine, we have the capability to make them, right? We have a massive drone industry. So I think this is a really positive sign. Again, the Ukrainians are clearly learning to speak President Trump's language, I think, which is the language of making money. And if they think there's the potential for a major money-making venture, particularly if it's one that enriches Trump or his family, that's going to go a long way towards favor within the administration. Now, that's good because the Kremlin has made it clear. They have no interest in the peace process, right? Of course, Zelensky has, heard Trump loud and clear when he said that as long as the peace process continues to move forward in good faith, that the U.S. would continue to provide aid to Ukraine. So Zelensky said, listen, I'm putting it on the calendar. We are going to have peace talks. Now the Russians, right? Zelensky is like, listen, we're going to do a new round of peace talks for Russia next week. Maybe it'll just be more prisoner exchanges. He says, that's fine. Anything as long as we can show that we are good faith negotiating. Russia, on the other hand, again, doing what it's always done, which is rejecting any ceasefire proposals, no meaningful truces, or just straight lies where they literally are like, yeah, there's a truce. And then that night launch, hundreds of Shaheds into civilian targets. So again, I think this is totally performative. Some people are like, oh, this is like real peace progress. It's not. This is a performance by Ukraine. Ukraine knows what Russia's going to do. Because there've been 6 rounds of peace talks, right? The Istanbul peace talks, the peace talks in Oman, the peace talks hosted at the White House. There's been so many of these peace talks. The shuttle diplomacy between Marco Rubio running back and forth between the two sides, Steve Witkoff and Keith Kellogg each meeting with their counterparts and then meeting together to try to hash it out. There's nothing. There's been no progress with any of these. There's been no significant change to the battlefield. So therefore, there's not going to be any significant change to the peace process. But this is about Ukraine doing the right thing. And Russia, again, doing what it always does, which is saying, yeah, we'll show up, but we're just going to make more extreme demands. Our demands are going to get more extreme, not less. We're going to send someone with no power to negotiate. We're going to send someone who's probably going to like they did last time, threaten the negotiators' families, right? That's not exactly a move that you do when you are sincere about reaching a peace accord, right? Imagine if, imagine if during the Korean War, the U.S. showed up and was just like, yeah, we're going to kill all of you and all your families. The Koreans would be like, no, dude, we're never going to do a peace deal here. There's no peace to be had. Anyway, guys, thank you so much to all of our Colonel tier members, James J. Tony Onyanko, George F. Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronic, Steve Rand, TR Need, Alan Knutson, CM Holmes, all of our Lieutenant tier members. Couldn't do it without you guys. Appreciate each and every one of you so much. And I will catch you guys in the next one. See ya. Cheers.